Now, I'd like to come to Professor Swaran Singh just to draw the distinction, because the principal charge, Professor Swaran Singh, of the opposition is that the government is not doing enough to counter China when it comes to these boundary issues, both diplomatically or politically, you might call it, or even on the ground in terms of the positioning of our resources, the armed resources. Now, can you draw the distinction where, before 2014, what the situation was and what is the situation now?
Thank you. I think two things need to be underlined. One, as Dr. Jaishankar mentioned in his comments, all of us understand difference between political discourse and how the national security is actually being handled. This is going to be normal that political parties will have their sometime mudslinging match, depending on which side of the aisle they are sitting. But I think more important to understand is that so far, armed forces have really stood up to China. World has recognized it. But more important than that is how armed forces have maintained enormous restraint in dealing with the challenges on a very complex terrain, with the armed forces which are one of world's most powerful. India is a nuclear weapon state. And then when you see clashes involving pushing, shoving and stone pelting, to me that underlines enormous restraint that I think should be, certain credit lies in that sense to how armed forces are trained. But I think there's also an issue of concern here. Because in last 30, 40 years, things have changed on both sides. China and India have become emerging nations. And as you mentioned, from 2014, I will actually say from 2012, certain things on the border interface or border face-offs have clearly changed.
Yes.
The level of frequency, the level of intensity, the level of magnitude of these so-called sort of face-offs is something that...
Yes, that has changed from earlier. You said 2012. I was asking in terms of the response of the government, how has that changed?
I think that is where one notices repeatedly the government in power today has underlined how there is a need to redefine the template of how India manages the border, to create new set of confidence building measures. There have been a set of mechanisms, mannerisms, conventions, treaties. For example, Corps commanders have had 16 meetings after Galwan incidents of June 2020. But the level of success in disengagement apparently is perhaps not as much as one would expect. Similarly, half a dozen interministerial with Ministry of External Affairs and MOFA of China. There's a working group for consultation and coordination on border has had meetings. So fundamentally, a certain template of how border was managed has continued to deliver, but it is showing certain fatigue. Partly because both nations have become very, very powerful. Infrastructure on the border have changed. The morale of armed forces has changed. So the frequency, intensity and magnitude of how quickly the armed forces can go to the frontiers on both sides increases the frequency of how regularly, hundreds of times you have these incursions or ingressions.
Yes.
But maybe, only one or two in a year become, part of discussions on television.
Yes, but Professor Swaran Singh, what happened in Galwan changed the way that India engages with China. A lot of rules were changed, a lot of Chinese companies were denied entry, a lot of apps were banned. All that did happen, and the China keeps on insisting that let's have business as usual, and India says it can't work that way. Things are not normal. And that is something that this government has done. We didn't see that in the past, did we?
I think very clearly there is a new assertion in Indian foreign policy and India's overall stature around the world now. And that applies to China also. So, as I said, India has stood up to China since Galwan of June 2020 incidents. And rest of the neighborhood of China has noticed that and recognized that India has stood up to China. Now, it of course involves a certain determination, but also involves a certain amount of costs. And therefore, India has to perhaps work towards managing border slightly with lesser deployments on the frontiers and find alternative means of, building mutual trust and confidence so that border management can become less costlier in terms of financial and hardships that armed forces have to face in sub-zero temperatures. They have high moral. They are very, very sort of driven and motivated soldiers, of course. But that is something that one has to keep in mind. And I think those kind of diplomatic gestures will have to lead to some kind of relaxed relationship on the border. But India has made it very clear. India's assertion is very clear. As long as border is not normal, relations cannot be normal. So I think that is new in terms of how India stands up and asserts its national interests. Whether you see it in other parts, Ukraine crisis have been another major example of how India has stood up. So China understands that increasingly, that in fact China perhaps expects and respects nations who stand up to challenges and follow their national interests pragmatically. And I assume you see the response from China is very muted. The spokesperson from Chinese side is saying, "Oh, border is stable." They are never able to sort of give any detail on their casualties or injuries to their soldiers. So they have been playing extremely muted compared to Indian Defence Minister making a formal statement in Parliament,
Yes.
which I think is expected the thing to happen. And I
Yes.
think that is where institutions like Parliament, armed forces are delivering in that
Let me
sense.
let
But
me let
what
me
I'm
let me
underlining
ask
is the
let me
challenges.
ask General Iran's now. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think people are very hopeful that things will work out because China does not want to resolve that situation. The other issue, Professor Swaran Singh, that seems to be still of concern is the trade deficit that we have with China, with so much talk of self-reliance in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the things that we want to replace Chinese imports. The PM was very very, very particular on the things that we need to target as well in terms of toys as well coming from China, but the deficit is widened. So that is something that still remains a concern. Now, why do you think that is taking time to address? Is it beyond something that the government can do? It has to come from the people itself, themselves.
I think both the Make in India campaign and now Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign are ideal solutions because bulk, and everybody agrees on this, bulk of what we import from China can be substituted by domestic production. To some extent, that was
At
also
competitive
tried
prices
along with the
and quality.
Chinese. The Chinese could themselves also come and produce things here. So that definitely is going to be a strategy which will ultimately help us resolve that formidable trade deficit with China, which has continued for over 15 years. And the biggest victim of that is China itself, because India-China trade can definitely reach up to $500 billion. The size of economies as such. Yeah, but it has continued to stay around $100 billion, and I think recently it crossed $225 billion. So fundamentally, trade cannot grow unless it is balanced and there is a certain mutuality in terms of give and take in that. Now, we can keep blaming on market access, quality control, regulation, and other things. But fundamentally, if their trade has to grow, then it must be something that both sides have to do. And formidable, enormous, almost $90 billion of deficit is something they need to address. But I think more important is right now to think of the fact that history, the past, will not be lesson for future. And therefore, I think border is something which is most significant between China and India. Of course, armed forces have ensured that peace and tranquility stays on the border. Armed forces are supposed to think of worst case scenarios. Diplomacy's task is to ensure that we never reach to those worst case scenarios. And at both levels, there is need to now think of future. Because the past, we have understood how to deal with that, but there are new challenges coming up in future. The infrastructure being built on both sides makes it very easy to bring enormous amount of heavy equipment, large number of soldiers, very quickly fast forward. And that kind of frequency which has gone up since 2012, I say, on repeated these face-offs on the border, needs some kind of completely reinventing of our tools and techniques to how to deal with that. Trade is something that can hurt, but it doesn't really make a huge dent on either side in terms of if trade sort of doesn't grow to $5 billion.
Okay.
But border is something which can be slippery, particularly because both nations are on a trajectory of very rapid growth, and they don't want to derail their kind of growth rate in fighting with each other. But if the frequency keeps increasing, sometime there are of course people who would be losing temper, and there could, things could go out of control. And the fact that more recently Galwan, Doklam, and of course now in Tawang sector, the frequency of these face-offs, particularly violent face-offs, is something that is something that needs attention, whether
Right.
in terms of building infrastructure.
Right.
China is building model
It's
villages
just
on the
that we have to
border,
keep on watching our flanks. We've always been watching.
that kind of investment
Yes.
is required at various levels, at levels of diplomacy, infrastructure, and armed forces.
Well, certainly that. Let's hope that stays the course, and we're able to stave off any larger confrontation. At the same time, try and settle differences as well. Although till now there haven't been any signs that China wants to resolve